course, there was a Venezuelan election that many people are saying was effectively kind of rigged, or at least like not a very legitimate election. It's funny. There's a lot of people on the left who are like immediately trying to say like, no, this is just propaganda. Like they're immediately just like, it's imperialist propaganda, bro. And it's kind of unclear to me, but one thing is definitely fishy: the fact that they didn't show the exit polls, like they didn't
Yeah.
publish the exit polls, and it's like, well, you clearly have something to hide if you're not doing that. But yeah, like, and then Gabriel Boric, he questioned the legitimacy of the election. I'm not sure what AMLO said about it. I'm kind of curious now, like, what the state of the alliances are between the different leftist governments of Latin America.
Yeah, he hasn't lost AMLO, but AMLO did say, like, I want to see the full results, which coming from AMLO is basically condemnation. Because AMLO, like, when he deals with, like, left-wing governments in Latin America, he almost never criticizes or really questions them.
To add a little bit more context into his answer, is that since he suffered an election fraud for his first run for presidency, him saying that is like pretty much like a lot of consistent with like what he asked at that time when he lost the election by 0.3 or 0.5%, I think it was. So it was like marginal, literally decimals.
Yeah.
Like Bush or numbers.
Yes. And the funny thing is that, you remember when we mentioned this electoral authority that was created to serve as an impartial observer of elections in Mexico? So this organ, when this 0.3% election comes to be disputed, they say, there might be some irregularities, but just to play it safe, we're going to burn everything. And they burned like all of the voting acts and so on and so forth. Too late though, because, and here's I think the big, one of the, also the big things in Mexico, they burned the acts, but not before citizens just went and took pictures of the results, right? Of the polls, and not the polls, but like the quick counts and so on. So like we actually had like a whole citizens effort where people set up websites where you could submit the results of your casilla, of your whatever, your region voting or whatever, and people could tally them up, and the numbers were just not adding up. You could check the official results against the results that people submitted. You could see the pictures, right, of the signs outside the voting booths. So like it was pretty transparent, and the fraud was very clear. AMLO, when that happens, he sets up an encampment, and he sets up a blockage disputing the election, and nothing happens. Like everybody knows it's fraud. We have proof. It's at the talk of the town, but because mass media doesn't report it, and we don't really have like massive social media presence or whatever, it just gets overlooked. It gets drowned out, and that changed over the course of the elections. And by the time AMLO came into power, social media was already replacing traditional media as the way people got their information. And that worked out perfectly for AMLO. And you can see it right now. I mean, it's so funny because AMLO has his morning conferences, right? He has press conferences every day. He is straight up a streamer. AMLO it's straight up like if you're talking with a streamer on Twitch, in the sense that bro is just standing in his podium, and people raise their hands and they just ask him questions and he answers them. He's looking with chat. Like he just gets up 6 a.m. By 7, he's standing in his press room ready to do his morning conference. And it's so funny to see people like Donald Trump try to co-opt that, because Donald Trump also tried to do his daily press conferences, but they were a joke.
You know that moment when Donald Trump was like, I love the Mexican president, even though he's a socialist?
Yeah.
I think prior to being elected, he had that book that was translated by Verso in English that you were quoting from, Andres, where he has some polemics against Trump, where he's like responding to Trump's kind of anti-immigrant, build that wall rhetoric. And it seems like, though, he's like really good negotiator, because like even Trump seems to like get along with him despite thinking he's a socialist, which I mean, I think at heart, is it fair to say he is? Like, at least at heart, he might be.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today, we're going to be talking about Mexico's contemporary political situation and the resounding victory of Mexico's Morena party and the newly elected president, Claudia Sheinbaum, a leader of Morena, and the successor to the previous president known as AMLO. And for this podcast, I'm very excited to bring on three guests, three people who live in Mexico, who I personally met and had great discussions with. I knew the first guest, who I'm going to introduce, Ernesto Vargas, is somebody who I did reading groups with back in the day with another frequent collaborator, Mike Watson of Revel Press. Ernesto and I go back, and when we met up in Mexico, you introduced me to some of your friends, the other two gentlemen with us today, Connor and Andres. I believe you, Ernesto, and Andres host a podcast called The Marxicanas, correct?
Marxicans.
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 Okay, that doesn't
It's
sound
already
as-
in English.
It's already in English. I thought it was only in Spanish.
It's in Spanish, but the title's in English.
The title is in
That-
English. Right.
to
It's a
appeal
trendy
more.
thing, you know.
Yeah. For
Sounds
audience.
Yeah, well, I think this podcast is going to be very interesting to my Canadian and American listeners because typically we're used to negative news. And a lot of the things that we cover on this show and on the main channel tend to put people in a bit of a nihilistic mood because a lot of the realities we are dealing with are not pleasant ones and can be a bit of a doomer pill, so to speak. But I think what's happening in Mexico is one of the few cases for hope for the international left. And it's a case study that I think carries a lot of lessons for the Western left and how we approach things. And there's a lot to pay attention to. So without further ado, I'll get you guys to maybe briefly introduce yourselves and name the one thing that you think is most important about the recent victory. And then from there, we'll delve into the specifics of Morena and its politics and everything you really need to know.
Right. Well, I'll go first. I'm Ernesto Vargas. And, well, as Tony already said, we go back a long way, a couple of years at least. And there's been some collaborations, so on and so forth. And I am one of the two hosts of the stream, you know, the Twitch stream that we're doing right now, titled Marxicans, which I do with my colleague Andres. And to answer your question, so I don't jab on too much, I guess right now we're actually seeing a repeat of, if I recall correctly, the situation back when Obrador won, which was that he had a majority in the Senate and the House of Representatives, or you know, it's analog in Mexico, and we didn't see anything happen back then. Right now, we are apparently going to see judicial reform go through. So we might be looking at a lot of reforms coming, hopefully, of the Constitution, which would really shake things up. So I'm looking forward to that reform.
So, hello everyone. I am Andres, the other host of the Marxicans stream, where we play video games, talk politics, and analyze stuff. So to answer your question, I think, and a little bit of a follow-up with Ernesto's answer, the reform package, it's pretty substantial. AMLO presented it on the 5th of February, which was pretty symbolic, pretty based.
Beautiful historical day.
Yeah, it was the day that Mexicans beat some French ass in the Batalla de Puebla, in the Battle of Puebla. So, and one of those reforms was the judicial reform, which I personally am really not as excited as some Morenists would be. But I'm more excited about the rest of the reforms because I think a lot of them are pretty good. Like, for example, there's one which tackles or starts to tackle or pretends to tackle the public housing crisis in a way that enables workers to actually rent houses that are made by the government, and up to a certain time, they have a chance to buy that home, and the amount that they paid these 10 years, that adds up to the, whatever final cost of the house is. So that helps a lot of people to try to have that possibility. It's still insufficient, but it's so interesting. So I think I'm very excited about that one. And I'm skeptic about the judicial reform, which I think Claudia will try to at least reform it again. Hopefully, I would say, just for the benefit of accessing justice for all Mexican people. But yeah, that's it. Connor.
Just to correct you before Connor goes on, the 5th of February is the day of the Constitution. That's the day when
the Battle of Puebla is
5th of May.
Right. Okay, you're right.
Cinco de Mayo.
Cinco de Mayo is right.
Americans forget what it is. We forget what it is. So,
yeah,
it makes sense. So the 5th of February has been a historic day for the Constitution in Mexico since like the 1837, was it? I don't know, 1830 something, when the first Constitution was published. And then, the second Constitution was also promulgated on the 5th of February. And then, presidents just love reforming the Constitution on the 5th. Anyway, Connor. 1824. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm Connor. I guess for a quick introduction to myself, I've lived in both Mexico and the United States. Around, I'd say, 2018, 2019, I got really into left-wing politics due to the Bernie Sanders campaign. And I even volunteered and everything. And that, in itself was a big, political lesson, and, believing in something enough to, go knock doors and volunteer for free, to drink the Kool-Aid and think, oh, yeah, we can win this. And then, the disappointment of losing and, the next few years kind of realizing that at least, in the very short term, the Bernie Sanders project is over. I kind of got absorbed into Biden and that more centrist liberal, Democrat agenda. And, bridging off of that, I think that what is so important about Morena's victory is that it shows that, we can actually win. Both politically and I kind of emphasize ideologically. In Mexico, before Morena won, there were a lot of ideas and culture and policy regarding meritocracy and these very right-wing ideas that, individual agency is what drives success. There's this expression, el pobre es pobre porque quiere, meaning, if you're poor, it's just because you want to be poor. And of course, anyone knows it's bullshit, but these ideas, kind of permeate in society and subconsciously influence how we talk about and see things. And ever since AMLO won, I've noticed that the public discourse has shifted to this more, maybe not left-wing always, but with a more focus on structural inequality, on poverty reduction. I think that one moment that really defines this was when the right-wing opposition candidate Xochitl Galvez did a fucking blood oath on national TV to not cut any social programs. Let that sit in. The level of ideological victory that happened, So yeah, I'm really excited to be on and talk more about Morena.
something to maybe contextualize for the audience. Claudia Sheinbaum won the most recent presidential election in Mexico by, I believe, was it 64%? It was a quite astounding margin. You don't see victories like that very often. And correct me if I'm wrong, was a coalition between two other left-wing parties and against a right-wing coalition and a right-wing center coalition of 3 different parties. They got totally destroyed. And basically, because this victory is so huge, they can now pass reforms at a constitutional level. And one of those reforms is the one you mentioned, which is the one you mentioned, Andres, the judicial reform. Everyone's talking about that. You're starting to see a lot of negative press for the first time in a while about Mexico's government, talking about the decline of checks and balances. And for those who don't know, basically the judicial reform, and I'll get you guys to elaborate, is to essentially have the judges be subject to popular vote and have a term limit of 12 years as opposed to life tenure and no popular vote. I know that's something I think might be of use in the American system because the Supreme Court is a bastion of corporate dominance there and supposedly is in Mexico too. So I'm curious about that first, because it'll be obvious at this point that like Morena is a left-wing government. But what does that really mean? Because we've had a lot of left-wing governments in Latin America. I guess this question people might ask are like, a socialist government, economic nationalists. What do they really what does Morena represent politically? What are their orientation? And I guess a follow-up question to that, because I'm giving you guys more to chew on because you're 3 people instead of 1 guest. What is the judicial reform? Because I want to tackle those other reforms you mentioned, all these other policies, but the judicial reform is the one that's everyone's talking about. So I guess we can maybe get into that first, because that is like the most controversial one. And but when answering that, I'd like you guys to elaborate as to Morena's political orientation, because that's a big interest for the audience.
Well, I think I can start since I'm the one that mentioned it. So the judicial reform responds to, or at least pretends to respond to, the lack of justice in Mexico and to the corruption that it's basically just rampant in the judicial system, specifically and only, which is, I think, there comes my criticism of it and many left-wing criticisms of it, that it only touches the judges themselves and not the other levels of the structural levels of the justice system, which, like, so for example, if they don't do anything about the police, they don't do anything about the prosecutors, which is Fiscalia, right? Which is
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So they don't touch the prosecutor, the general prosecutor. And so those are like your first levels of access or trying to access justice. Like the judge is just receiving, the paperwork, analyzing it and saying, you're good, you're in jail, basically. So this reform pretends to try to give justice to people through popular vote, which, I'm 100% agree that the democratization of power and the popular vote and to submit judges to popular vote, which, I'm fine with it. And this brings up a series of questions. Now, there have been certain criticisms from the left that Morena has tried before when they didn't had the majority of, either the both House of Representatives and the senators. They didn't have majority to try to push reforms that they knew they wouldn't be passed, but they would start the conversation, and that will permit them that would enable them to dominate the conversation and to handle that to their way, even though they would need to lose a few things, right? So now that they have it, they have continued to do this strategy. And I think that comes with its risks because there are things like at last minute that they've added into the judicial reform that I think might mess or just not help in the general access of justice, which one of them is the faceless judges, which is, I think, like, it's basically some things, it's a figure that would only apply in cases of organized crime. So if there is a case where, you know, the accused is part of organized crime, which organized crime legally can mean just if you got 3 people and they're in possession of a drug, that's, you know, basically organized crime. And that basically enables a judge to hide their identity so that they don't get targeted. But that figure has been applied in other governments, particularly with the godforsaken, which has gladly passed away, the Peruvian dictator. So that comes with a lot of things that I'm not sure, I'm hoping that, you know, through the secondary reforms that will probably be brought in by Claudia's government, will try to amend that specifically. So there are things that in for Morena that have been definitely left wing, but now I think we are transitioning into a stage of Morena that, as leftists, we need to be highly critical and very observant in their actions, because the fact that is that, you know, they hold the majority. And what I would not like to see is that the constant left-wing discourse has or starts to go sideways. So I think that as leftists, it's definitely our responsibility to try to just insist and try to move that to the correct direction through either action or just, you know, propaganda or whatever. But yeah, that's my general opinion of that.
Well, to that point, I remember when I was talking to you, talking to all of you, one thing that really struck with me is that all of you guys seem to identify to some extent as Marxist adjacent, at least. And you all were very supportive of Morena, of the government, while giving us sort of critical support, also being critical. And you seem a little bit more critical now than before. But this is a little rare with leftists because, you know, I tend to see, for example, like radical leftists in France are very, very critical of like their left wing. And I guess it's because Europe social democrats have a very bad track record of implementing neoliberalism and austerity. And same with the Labour Party as of recent in England, ever since Corbyn was booted out. And in America, there's not much to hope for at all, because all you really have is the Democrat Party, which was never even a Labour Party to begin with. But to see, you know, self-described Marxists supporting the government, they must be doing something right. And you mentioned that most people who are sort of on the radical left have a belief that it's better to try to work with the Morena government to some extent, or pressure it, rather than, you know, like build some kind of, right now it doesn't really seem to be any revolutionary situation outside of it. And that was surprising to me. But yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense that you wouldn't just be like a regime mascot, right? Like how some leftists are with China, or, you know, like certain governments, but to have like critical support of it and challenge it. But I guess one question I would ask again, and add both of you to maybe elaborate on, is I guess, what the political orientation of Morena more broadly. Because Claudia, of course, you know, I guess for the lay audience to remind, Claudia is the successor to Andrés Manuel López Obrador.
Yes.
AMLO, yeah, because it's AMLO is the acronym for his name, yeah. very popular president, elected in 2018 and ran, I think, in 2003 and lost the election with a very controversial dispute. 2005. 2006. Okay, I was
6
close.
and 12. as
Right,
well.
right.
Yeah, he
You know,
never gave
of
up.
course, 2003, that was a war on drugs, yes. So, yeah. But anyhow, that's kind of what's the situation. Claudia is the successor of this highly popular party. So I guess if you guys could maybe describe like the politics of Morena, because obviously a party is within it many factions, and already this victory was a coalition. So I'm a little bit curious about that, like the right, left, and center of Morena.
Well,
Yeah,
Connor, if you'd like, you can explain the the actual facts, because I have some thoughts about the ideological content of Morena. Going back to 1827.
Oh yeah,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
the thing. Yeah, like to understand Morena fully, there is a lot of background history. But I guess like since we don't have a whole semester's worth of like college classes to explain, in summary, Morena is, I'd say, the awkward marriage of the left wing of the pre-dictatorship and the socialist electoral left. There was a process, I would say, in the 80s and early 90s where the left flank of PRI and a lot of like what I'd call left-wing satellite parties, I'd say kind of like how the Communist Party is in Russia, where they have some autonomy, but they have to follow the federal government's line, decided to break off from the PRI due to neoliberal reforms. The PRI basically decided, facing economic crisis, to embrace like orthodox neoliberal economics and just forcefully push out of voices in the party that wanted a more statist approach. And understanding this dynamic is, I think, key to getting Morena, because it's a massive contradiction. It's like, I've talked about this friends before, how, for example, you have like Omar Garcia Harfuch, basically a cop whose dad was a security official in the dictatorship, who persecuted leftists in the same party as the leftists that were persecuted, So it's just a cacophony of voices and perspectives. But I guess like the thing that kind of bridges it together is, one, a belief in a more statist approach to policy, especially with AMLO. AMLO kind of like always thinks that the government should solve problems. So for example, there's like this issue with underdevelopment in the south of the country, and the AMLO approach isn't to like create some weird fiscal incentive or some policy program that's going to draw like more investment somehow to the south. He just said, fuck it, let's build trains, refineries, have the military do it. There were issues with like air travel, so he said, let's make a government airline, et cetera. And I guess it's interesting. I don't really know exactly how to like easily label Morena to an outside audience, but I guess to summarize it, it'd be the awkward marriage of like old regime guys and democratic socialists.
I'd be happy to go right into the history, but I know, Ernesto, you have something to say about the ideological content of Morena.
Yes. So in Mexico, liberalism has a particular history, right? And that is that when we declared our independence and chartered our constitution for the Mexican Republic back in 1827, so we had a split between Catholic liberals and liberal liberals, so to speak, and you also had a split.
Republicans, right?
Yeah, I guess would be the term. Yeah, Republicans.
Like secular
Republicans.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that would be the term. And that schism kind of dissipated when Porfirio Diaz took power. He kind of forced liberalism to transition to this complete separation from the church, right? And we had the revolution, which we could get into, like you said, in a different episode. But during the revolution, despite having a really radical 1910 to 1917.
That's right, yeah.
1910
when it ends, yeah.
So 17 is when it ends. And when we write our next constitution. And by then, liberals were mostly separate from the church. But something interesting happened in the 30s as time rolled by. And that was the preamble of the Second World War. Because as you know, the Spanish Civil War was met with the support of the Italian fascists and the Germans, right? And that's what created like this whole economic chain, right? That allowed each respective point to get to power. And because of the Spanish Civil War, a lot of Spanish liberals fled to Mexico. And that created a resurgence of Catholic liberalism. So what I'm saying is that Morena is this stew, right? As Connor was saying, it's this unholy mixture of Catholic liberals of like 3 different ages, and you have Marxists, you have statists, you have Zapatistas. I guess I wouldn't say Zapatistas support Morena, but maybe some, maybe like 1 or 2. I don't know. But you have sectors from all of the. You have just what's the like shrapnel from each conservative strata, like shavings of each conservative
Yeah.
strata that have poured into Morena because they all oppose, well, pretty much statism and quote unquote corruption. Because the big thing in Mexico was centralism, right? And the vertical authority. So that was a problem because we were, a colony. Then we were briefly an empire / the viceroyship. Then the republic and the Porfiriato period, like were again periods of great authoritarianism. So Morena has opposition to that from a lot of different stages of the ideological development of Mexico. So you get people like Andres was saying or Connor was saying that either they think that the holiest of rights to enshrine is the judge's right to privacy. And that makes perfect sense for them to be left wing and to think that. Because they trace their ideological line back to some liberal idiot from 1910 or whatever, and nobody agrees with him, but he has like a whole school of thought now, and disciples and influence, and people who just carry his ideas forward without even thinking about it. And in Mexico, you see a lot of that. I think it's one of the things that makes me very hopeful about Mexican politics in general, that there's a lot of context to explore, a lot of things to read. I personally wasn't so aware until very recently of this whole involvement of the Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, with the intellectual development of the opposition in Mexico. Because that's the thing, right? Conservatives were the opposition for a long while because of the rampant corruption. And that ties back to the facts, right, that Connor was talking about. These tricky business deals that the National Revolutionary Party kept making to keep their grip of power. A deal that they eventually struck with the PAN, and which led to the current situation, which is the fact that they don't have any power anymore.
PAN is the Christian Nationalist Party, right?
I would say
Sorry,
they do have like a kind of like
Catholic.
Catholic. There is like a fascistic, like nationalistic, like tendency in PAN, but the mainstream party are more like, I guess they identify as like European center-rightists. So like conservatives,
Presently,
but kind of
definitely. Yeah, presently, definitely. Because funnily enough, I was actually reading their manifest from when they founded the party in, I think, 1938 or
they're very reactionary back then.
Yeah, but here's the thing. They explicitly state that they oppose capitalism. Right? Because back then, that was the thing. The capitalism was failing abjectly. And every government was, trying their best to propose something different. You had the New Deal in the United States. And in Mexico, you had the protectionismo that led to the Mexican miracle.
The Cardenas, right? The President Cardenas was like sort of the Roosevelt of Mexico.
Yes.
Huh?
Definitely.
Yeah. So Cardenas was leader of the PRI, the PRI, correct? Like one of them, the early leaders.
Back then, I think it was called the Partido Mexicano Revolucionario. No, Partido Revolución Mexicana.
PNR.
Yeah,
But isn't it
PNR.
Partido Nacional Revolucionario, that's right.
Yeah, the PNR.
the PNR, right? And then it
National
changes its name-
Revolutionary Party.
right? And then it changes name to like Institutional Revolutionary Party, right?
So the revolution was institutionalized.
Quite
Uh-huh.
literally, yeah. Like
Yeah.
it's they kind of say upfront, like there were a lot of like conflicts and like revolutionary leaders were literally assassinating each other. So the party just made a system to stop that.
Right. Yeah. That sounds like what was described in the summary book called the Mexican Revolution: A Brief Introduction. It was like a 130-page short little book on the Mexican Revolution that did tell a history of the PRI, a very short one. But I'll give this little summary for the lay audience, and you can correct me on anything I miss and elaborate much further. But on Morena's origins, it's related to the PRD was essentially the party that split from the PRI after the PRI pushed out all the leftists, because the PRI was basically like as you mentioned, the institutionalization of the Mexican Revolution that sort of put a stability to what was a long period of chaos. And they essentially ran what was sometimes described by academics as the perfect dictatorship for 70 years, I believe. And in that period, they kind of had like left and wing turns. They, under President Cardenas, was sort of like, I think, self-described socialist, but not Marxist, but self-described socialist in terms of like implementing a lot of radical reforms. It's kind of like a very popular president. And then I know, or I'm not sure exactly when, but around the 60s, the PRI definitely had like a rightward shift. And then there was a bunch of left-wing student protests, and they basically killed a shit ton of protesters in like brutal authoritarian fashion. The Dirty War, the Mexican Dirty War, right? And then
That was when it started.
it started, right?
Yeah, it's the next decades is a dirty war.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And then then when does the PRD when does the PRD start? Which is like break from the PRI into a sort of left faction, like a left faction that breaks from the PRI. When does the PRD start?
So I'd say that it would start around like the end of the 80s, with like during the neoliberal reforms of the PRI, and when they pushed the left out. Within the PRI, there was a faction called Corriente Democrática, so like the Democratic Current. And this is basically the left flank of the PRI that was, openly agitating against neoliberalism. Not exactly like, democratic socialists or some like super kosher, great, a left-wing faction, but they were the guys who were against statism. And the leader of that current was called Democratic.
Against the market reform and
against like neoliberalism and everything. And Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas was the leader of that current. He was Lázaro Cárdenas' son, actually. And what happened is that the PRI eventually just expelled that whole faction from the party. They just said, like, you don't get a seat at this table. And then Cuauhtémoc decided to run in the next presidential election as a left-wing candidate, which was, pretty crazy for the moment, since sometimes PRI did have opposition in elections, but it was always like a fake deal where everybody know that your vote wouldn't be counted if you voted for him. But here you had, like, for the first time, an opposition figure that had actual, institutional backing from powerful people. So he didn't have time to like register a party, but he just kind of got like the candidacies for all these smaller satellite left-wing parties who were also pushed out. And he presented in the 88 election. And it's widely believed that he won. However, on election night, about halfway through the vote count, the government quite literally just shut the electoral computer off and said, the server failed. We have to, do some maintenance. And then when they turned it back on, somehow Salinas and Gortari had just won by a massive margin. And this was like the end of the dictatorship. I kind of like see like kind of like a mirror was what happened now with Maduro and Venezuela, where Salinas won and nothing was going to change that. But the mandate for another fraud at that level was gone. Like everyone saw the system for what it was. So Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas and the right-wing party PAN, their leaders sat down with the PRI and basically negotiated a peaceful exit to the situation. They got the government to create an autonomous electoral authority, which I think back then was called IFE, the Federal Electoral Institute, which would be an autonomous body that managed elections without people within the government itself saying how it's going to be ran, because that's obviously a huge conflict of interest. And then what followed was this really awkward era where Mexico was starting to become a democracy, where on paper, pre-PAN PRD could compete, but in practice, the PRD still faced institutional repression. PRD politicians would be killed, they'd be arrested, or there'd just be like selective fraud where if PAN won an election, then, they'd respect it. But in states like Michoacan, when PRD clearly won the governorship, they'd say, nope, some weird bullshit would happen and the PRI guy would win. And that was the context where the Mexican left kind of languished for about a decade. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas ran, I believe, for 2 more elections and lost votes. And at this point, within the PRD, there was this big existential debate, I'd say around 2001, about what to do next, because Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas and his faction just doesn't win elections. When it isn't statist repression, it was also the fact that PAN was just kind of seen as the mainstream opposition to PRI. It was either center or the right. And this is when Andrés Manuel López Obrador enters the picture. He was also one of the founding members of the party. AMLO. Well, when was he mayor of Mexico City? Or not mayor, but governor? Was that 2000?
It was 2000s. Yeah, I think so. It was early 2000s. And he's actually, I'm almost positive that comparatively to all of the mayors of Mexico City, he's the top number 1 or number 2. Yeah. Popular. Ratings? Yeah, ratings in that sense, popular. So yeah. And he was the one that started to I think you see a lot of his policies that would also be implemented on a national level on his presidency, on a micro, quote unquote, because it's Mexico City. It's a massive, massive place. But yeah, it was around those years.
Yeah, and AMLO's, I think what was it, governorship or mayorship? I forget the official title for the head of state at the time. But we're during his government in Mexico City, this is when the PRD started to really establish itself as a serious political force, because like Andrés mentioned, Mexico City is a population of a small country. If you run Mexico City, you can be president. That has been traditionally the pathway of the Mexican presidency is, first you run Mexico City, a big state, and then you go for the big one. And AMLO did that.
At that time, there were around 8 million people around, more or less, million living in Mexico City. So that's the place.
Yeah. Yes, to answer your question, Claudia was governor. Yeah.
Claudia mayor or governor of Mexico City?
I mean, you could say governor.
Yeah. It's a special title called chief of government.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the translation would be head of state. But yeah, the Mexico City is its own special jurisdiction, kind of let's say Washington, D.C. in the United States, where it's not quite a state, but it is. But yeah, and what Andrés mentioned too about how you could see hints of AMLO's presidency, during his governorship. That's true. A lot of the interesting thing about AMLO's term as a governor is that I won't even just say by popularity he was one of the best. I think even people who are critics of AMLO today would say no, he was a great governor of Mexico City.
Oh, yeah.
For example,
I mean, in results, definitely that was also my thing. Not only popularly, but I think on our results, you can measure his results versus other governors. He's definitely at the top.
Yeah, and one interesting detail about how he ran Mexico City, and this kind of connects to runs his government. He didn't actually do much public spending. Or didn't raise much taxes, although he has limited powers to raise taxes. The Mexican government works. Usually, what he did for a lot of his public works projects was negotiate with the business community and get the private sector to take initiative in funding it. So this was kind of an economic cheat code. Yeah, to have his cake and eat it. He get to he somehow figured out how to govern a leftist, but not spend like a leftist. And this is really key. I guess going forward when you talk about his presidency, but he has this very weird ideology where he wants like the government to be statist, but also really values austerity. And this is because in AMLO's diagnosis of Mexican neoliberalism, austerity is a good thing. He kind of sees the corruption in Mexico as a system where they privatize public services. You know, they cut the government spending that goes to people at the bottom of the food chain, the people who most need it, and instead use what little resources are left to give, you know, business contracts and business handouts to corrupt elites. You know, that's kind of like the Mexican definition of neoliberalism. So when AMLO governs and he does austerity, it's kind of weird because in the English-speaking world, austerity is a right-wing saying, it's a right-wing framework. And for AMLO, and I don't really fully agree with this, his idea is I'm going to cut socials, I'm going to cut public spending because it's just going to go to the pockets of corrupt people. And that's kind of like in the context of how he governs.
From what I heard is he defunded the bureaucracy. He cut the bureaucracy a lot, but he also increased spending on all sort of social services like pensions and various social programs for the poor and minorities, no?
Correct. He also raised the minimum wage.
Doubled, basically. Like doubled the minimum wage. And I think that has also, I think that like his work policies has been the most fundamental, like one of the key aspects of why Morena has, you know, just kept coming out up top. Like the fact that you raise the minimum wage up to double for people, even though, I mean, obviously we understand that that policy specifically affects only the people that are like have a legal permit, basically, or legally allowed to work. I'm not talking about, yeah, exactly, formally employed, because there are informal employees that are
paid
not
in cash.
You know, yeah, paid in cash. But still, it's a pretty highly progressive policy that has changed people's lives, like objectively for the better. And I don't think that the opposition still sees that. Like, and I'm honestly, I'm even surprised of that, because you're after a series of defeats, consistent defeats, and each one bigger than the last one. And their argument is always like that the voters are the problem, basically. And they don't see an internal, a very solid internal self-criticizing movement from within those parties. They just continue to lash out at others. And I think that has, you know, definitely has like two different outcomes. Like, what, it could be good because you're just like, your opposition is just completely useless. And also that could also mean, you know, the possibility of an opposition that might stem from that infighting. Also, that does not happen, and Morena, you know, just keeps amassing power. You know, things can happen, and I think that it's the risk which the opposition is focusing on, and not actually like on the things that they should do to stop that, but also to see themselves in the historical moment as in trying to just make a new start, in the sense that the policies that they were pushing forward for the last 30 years have not made a significant impact to people comparatively to the policies of AMLO for social spending, etc. And so they need to change those, like, their vision, basically just erase neoliberalism within their ranks and try to push more progressive policies, because the society itself demands it. Like, for example, if you compare the United States to Mexico, the United States, it's just two parties, and both parties more or less, just go for the same policies. Basically, that's subtle differences in between. They push forward to one direction because there's no revolutionary movements, or there's no consistently an opposition that's trying to change that. And in Mexico, I think it was the moment that Morena rose to power and started to rise to power, they pushed forward to this new like Mexican moment of like more progressive policies. And so I think that those right-wing parties, they need to move left and not further right, which is like, I think it's the risk of like we're seeing right now.
One thing that you mentioned to me when we were talking in Mexico that I thought about for a long time was that the right and center opposition in Mexico is predominantly made up of the professional managerial class and the upper classes, who appear to be very out of touch with the working majority. And because they're out of touch with the working majority, they massively were wrong in their prediction for the recent election and the previous election in which AMLO won in 2018. They thought that they would have a strong chance, but the polls contradicted them heavily. And because they were so out of touch with what people really want, it hindered their strength electorally, despite the fact that they have they have big money behind them. And this was an important detail because I find that the left in Canada and the United States has sort of the opposite situation, whereas the left, and not only the left, but the left is very, or what you might call the actually existing left, I guess, in Canada, the United States, tends to be very out of touch with the working majority, and is often led by people of like activist middle class backgrounds who don't really talk to regular working people very often and speak in a sort of language that's disconnected. Whereas from what I read about AMLO's story is that AMLO actually criticized a lot of the activist left, even in Latin America, and took a different path by catering to issues that he believed more workers cared about. Some of which you might argue that he was right in doing, some that perhaps he wasn't correct in doing because he considered gender issues and the social issues to be of less importance compared to economic issues. And that's fair, but he also thought environment issues weren't that important, right? And I remember you pointing that out as actually a critique of the Morena government being the environmental policy of the Mexican government. So yeah, would you care to elaborate on any of that?
Yeah. So what I found interesting is that and this also, it's funny because it also stems from it also gave rise to a certain critique of the right-wing movements, right-wing opposition, which is that AMLO has been in campaign for more than 20 years, now almost 30, I would say. And the reason for that is because AMLO, I think he's basically the only politician in, I would even dare say, in Mexican history that has effectively visited like almost all of the country. Like even the most forgotten, godforsaken places in all of Mexico, he has gone to them. And that speaks volumes for the fact that like there's this name of the movie. I will let you know, but there was this movie, or I think it was a short film where, and I'm telling you this because there's a sort of social reason for that. So there was a film in which there was this popular local band, with like trumpets and just other instruments. And that band was just working to those band members were excited because there was going to be a politician that was going to visit the town members and, just basically do a show, so they were trying to give him a show of like, we're so happy that you're here. Please listen to our, pledges through, their band music and whatever. And through that story, the politician never arrived. And it was sort of like a reflection of how people from remote towns genuinely get excited whenever a person of importance visits them. And since, Mexicans in general were very homey, very warm, welcoming, they were trying to prepare this for them, but they never came. And so that reflects a lot of what happens in like local politics, in which even your own mayor will never visit you. It will never they will never reach out to you or try to listen to you, only when they're in campaign. And so the fact that even AMLO, even when he was not in an electoral period, he visited towns which were like never visited by anyone of small importance, that really changed people's perception of him. So the fact that he visited the poorest places in all of Mexico, the people from those places, it just changed completely their perception of him. And so if at a later date, somebody else, some other politician visits them, they will not care, because AMLO visited them first. And so that really resonates with people. And I think that is one of the key aspects of, AMLO's just whole life work in that sense, and how he has translated that into his policies, into his social policies, because he has seen the country in more ways than all of the opposition will ever know. And so it's pretty interesting to see how, like, I am even surprised that he's, a very old man, and he still remembers a lot of the things, very specific situations, dishes, popular dishes, places, traditions from very specific municipalities in the different parts of the country. Then he mentions those things in his like daily conferences with like crystal clear descriptions. So I think that definitely as a propagandist, he's a genius. And through that, his social policies, you will understand why he has given certain focus to, as you were saying, economic policies, and not so much as gender oriented, which would be like the traditional or like the more contemporary perception of like what the left is, like, for example, in Western America or Canada, where like, you're just trying to deal with gender issues, racial issues, etc. And he has focused more on trying to lessen the misery people through economic policies and through social spending.
Yeah, I remember you mentioning that AMLO is an excellent orator, and because he got a lot of negative press from the mainstream media when he was first running, and his plea that the election that he ran in 2006 wasn't fair was largely kind of dismissed by the media intelligentsia, the media elites. He sort of started his new media platform by spreading his message online. And still to this day, you mentioned that he's essentially kind of like a streamer, and that he has his like conferences where he gives an update about the state of Mexico and shares his messages. And he has this long view historical perspective where he always historically contextualizes everything. And I thought that to be absolutely fascinating and a key lesson for leftists around the world.
I'm glad you mentioned historical context, because so to add to Andres' answer, you have to consider the fact that Andres Manuel has, quote unquote, walked the walk. He has quite literally walked to every municipality in the country, but also since very young, he's worked in government. He's been a bureaucrat, right? And an activist, both things the same. And that's no coincidence. The fact that he could shoulder the movement and carry it forward is not just random. It has to do with that. And it's the same reason why Lázaro Cárdenas came to power. He was a popular leader, Cárdenas. He was a general back in the Mexican Revolution. And he, as soon as he came to power, he engaged in mass politics to really, really differentiate himself from the previous government. And that's pretty much what Andres was saying, right? That it's a matter of effective policy and of knowing which policy will be the most, I guess, will give you the best return on investment, to speak like a business school terms, in the sense that how will you garner the most amount of popular support so that your movement maintains momentum? Because the thing, going back to this whole thing we're talking about liberals and so on, the Mexican Constitution is a very progressive document. The third article of the Mexican Constitution has actually been a very controversial one. Cárdenas, during his administration, actually reformed it. And he added, because, okay, so I'll summarize the first three articles just for the audience. Article 1 of the Mexican Constitution is a guarantee of human rights. And that includes human rights as elaborated on by the rest of the document, as well as rights as defined by treaties signed by the Mexican state. So any international treaty that the Mexican state has signed is by constitutional law, also effective. And the second article is, I guess, laying on paper of the rights of indigenous people, because it establishes that the Mexican state is a plural state, multi-ethnic state, so on and so forth. And then the third article of the Constitution states that all education must be free. Straight up, the government has to pay for all elementary, middle, high school, and high education. The whole thing has to be sponsored by the government, and that's constitutional law. And Cárdenas, back in his day, as one of his zany populist moves, he reformed the third article of the Constitution to say that the education that the government had to provide had to be, and you can Google this, socialist. The Constitution straight up said free socialist education for every Mexican citizen at some point. This was reformed out. If you check the Constitution now, it doesn't say that anymore. But there was a period of time in Mexico. So what I'm trying to say here is that on paper, and that's the reason why, to go back to your first question, why we as Marxists support this, that on paper, the Mexican state is actually quite progressive. It's just the matter that on practice it isn't. And you will find both left and right-wing actors who both agree that the focus of the Mexican government should be to guarantee the Constitution. Because the Constitution is honestly a mishmash of like straight up almost socialist ideas or communist ideas, if you want to say. I wouldn't say that, but whatever. I mean, I think it would be more technically accurate to call them socialist, and liberal ideas. Like, so at some point, right, you have the thing, as Connor mentioned to me, and he can go into this later, that the government owns all land, right, in Mexico. You can technically own land in Mexico. And at the same time,
That's still the
government...
case?
Sorry?
Is that still the case to this day?
Yes.
Interesting. Like China and Taiwan have that.
Go again, Tony?
No, I just said that China and Taiwan have those laws, but I know certainly in Canada and the United States they don't, because in Canada it's like very impossible to even start a small business because you have to pay so much to private landlords.
Yeah, I mean, you can just like in China, you can have a deed to a piece of land in Mexico. course. But you have to pay the government for that, right? And the government is the ultimate owner of that land, even if you have a usufructo. I don't know what the English term is, but it's pretty much legal use of the land.
Right.
Anyway, my point is that on paper, right, according to the Constitution, you have very, very progressive ideals. The problem is that you rarely have people with the political weight to carry them out. Lázaro Cárdenas was an exception to this because of his movement, right? His personal trajectory through the history of Mexico. Something that is honestly a matter of contingence. It's not something that's actually like destiny or whatever. What it is, it might not be destiny, but it's fate. I think would be a good way of putting it. And it's the same thing for AMLO, right? It's not that he was put on earth to become the president of Mexico or whatever, but his personal development led to such a thing. As Connor said, you become the head of government of Mexico City, and eventually you're going to be president, right? And well, anyway, do you guys have anything else to add?
Yeah, AMLO, like, I guess I would add is that just in general, I've known a few people who have met him, and unanimously, they've all said that he's an exceptional person. Like, he's one of those people that you meet and, like, never forget. Like, kind of like what you mentioned was how he traveled to every municipality in the country. Like, when it comes to the part of politics, just shaking hands and kissing babies, AMLO, like, has that down to an art. Another thing I think that's really important to mention about his trajectory is that he's persistent. People like I think you mentioned earlier, like, have given him criticism, they've given him shit because he's lost so many elections that just never knew to give up. But I mean, in 2018, he won. They won massively. And that's kind of like one thing I've heard too from people who've known AMLO is that if you met him, like, you'll kind of notice this is a man who is extremely determined. Like, I don't know at which point of in his life he decided he was going to be president of Mexico, but I think it's kind of like figures it's like Napoleon or Bolivar, where these are people who just got an idea in their head and just made it happen, or did everything they could to make it happen. So yeah, like, and I don't really say this in the sense of like trying to like deify AMLO, but credit due where credit is due. Like, even his opponents will, at least in private, admit, the dude's brilliant. Like, I've spoken to people who've met like right wing politicians, and they'll say behind closed doors, like, "Oh, this guy, fucking idiot. Doesn't know what he's doing." Blah blah. I've never heard that from people who've met AMLO.
How many times did AMLO run for president prior to winning?
2 prior to winning.
Interesting.
The third one was
in Spanish, we have a saying. Well, also in English, third time's the charm, right?
Yeah.
In Spanish, we say la tercera es la vencida.
If only Bernie Sanders wasn't so old and America was just a little bit more democratic.
Yeah, I also want to say that I think, like, since we're talking about, AMLO's style politics as character traits, I like to make a comparison between Bernie and AMLO, because Bernie, like, he's a really nice guy from everything I've heard. I like everything he says. I don't know if he's a good politician. That's, like, I think one takeaway that the left needs, like, if you were to study AMLO and Morena, is, like, it's awesome to be right, but you also need to be good at politics to win, because just kind of, like, looking back on, like, 2020 primary, to an extent the 2016 one, a lot of left-wingers, rightfully complained that, oh, the Democratic Party and the media establishment, was against Bernie from the get-go and didn't let him win. Oh, it's so unfair that he and Klobuchar, like, backed down to endorse Biden in the last moment. But that's politics. You have to play the game. And one thing I will say is that AMLO is exceptional at cutting deals and building coalitions and, getting those endorsements or that, like, institutional support that you need to win the presidency. Because I think something that, like, Western, I guess, American leftists need to get. Politics, like, isn't just like the Bernie Sanders theory where, oh, if you say the right stuff and collect, donations from small donors and get enough volunteers, you can win. I wish it was like that, but no, you got to cut deals with like James Clyburns and the power brokers of the world, and AMLO got that.
Yeah. I've always felt Bernie Sanders was never Machiavellian enough. And to be a successful politician, you have to be a little bit Machiavellian. And this is something actually you and I, Connor, were talking about with regard to different Latin American leaders. And that's something I'd like to talk about in the back room later on, about the leaders of Venezuela, Chile, Colombia, and Bolivia, and how they compare to Mexico's government, because you had some very interesting observations about the political sophistication of different leaders and the varying extent to which they're like good at politics. But speaking of good at politics and coalition building, who exactly is in Morena's current coalition, and that Morena's coalition against the right-leaning coalition? Like, is it just a left coalition, a left center coalition? Because I saw there's two other parties, and one of them's a Green Party. I don't remember what the name of the other party was, but yeah, tell us about that.
So I'd say that the other party, PT, which I guess would translate to like the Labor Party, they're, I guess at least on paper, like this hard left party. If you look at like their party documents, it's straight up a Maoist party. But in practice, it's more of a I guess it's more of like a machine politics, like left of center party that supports Morena. What I think would be interesting is that the Green Party. And Ernesto or Andres, how would you explain the Green Party in Mexico?
I think the Green Party would be if you had a bunch of like landlords, and because I know that in the South there were a few just fraud cases with like some political young leaders of the party, but it's basically just a party who's like open for business, basically. And so they catalog themselves as green, but at the same time they have like multiple times proposed to just do death sentences again, like bring back death sentence. And at the same time, like, just whatever insane random policy that might give them some extra votes for them to keep fueling and siphoning money out of their apparatus, that will work out. So the Green Party has historically been pretty close to the PRI when the PRI actually had power. And so from the moment that the PRI started to lose power, the Green Party said, okay, I think business is not going to be booming with you, so I think I'm going to switch sides. That's basically it. So it's just not an ideological party. It's more of an like just economic. Yeah, it's a business basically.
Why is the Green Party in every single country so shit? Always the Green Party is always shit. Like, in Europe, I know in Germany, the Green Party is known for being terrible. In Canada, the Green Party is horrible, and I hate their guts because the Green Party always fools a lot of like lay voters into thinking that they're actually to the left of the NDP, which is already a kind of not so great party, but the NDP is definitely to the left of the Greens. And I know some people have voted for the Greens thinking, oh, I thought they were like the more anti-establishment party. It's like, no, not at all. They're like, Elon Musk 3 years ago before his Trump turn. That's basically what they are.
Yeah, I have two words for you. Carbon credits. That's Green Parties for me all the time. Like the extent of their policy is pushing carbon credits.
Yeah, or like opposing nuclear and like stealing votes from, like you say, like the runner-up left party.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're like controlled opposition. Sometimes I wonder if they are backed by like a.
Well, in Mexico, they were pretty much a satellite of PRI, like straight up.
Yeah, basically.
If you were to like make an honest Wikipedia article and like write their ideology, it would just say politics. Like it is just like the most cynical Machiavellian party, and it's like it's weird. Like right now, Morena is like super majority, and both like the Chamber of Deputies, the lower chamber, and Senate rely entirely on the Green Party because due to some like I guess you could call this a loophole in how like congressional seats are appointed. The Green Party got a lot of seats, like enough to basically like be the kingmaker and whether Morena, I guess, to pass constitutional reforms or not. And this is kind of really interesting detail for me because up to this point, we're saying with the judicial reform, the Green Party has been loyal to Morena. They've played ball. Morena says, we want to pass this constitutional reform. And the business party just says, yeah, give us whatever it is we want, money, connections, and we'll do it. But like, I can't get out of my mind that they did the same thing with Green Pond. And when, tides change, they immediately jump ship. And like, I kind of think it's like a mercenary dynamic where right now the mercenaries are staunch Morena allies, but who knows in the future. I kind of like what I point out when I talked about this with people who are very pessimistic about Morena just having unchallenged rule and what that implies. And I just going to say, well, they depend on the Greens. They depend on the shittiest, scummiest, two-faced people in politics. Wait and see.
Yeah, on that note, a lot of, well, I shouldn't say a lot of people, really just like Western intelligentsia media elites have been ringing the bell of democracy with regard to Mexico recently and the judicial reforms. Some are saying that these reforms will undermine democracy, and some are a little more honest in that they're saying that they're gonna essentially reduce the amount of checks and balances, which if they were to be a little more honest, they are reducing the checks and balances against democracy, because the founding fathers of the United States were a lot more honest when describing the role of the Supreme Court as a check on democracy. I mean, that's always what the Supreme Court was. It's supposed to be a check on the popular rule. That's what it is, right? And this new reform to have these judges subjected to popular rule has been, labeled by some liberal elites as like a threat to democracy. So I'm curious, to what extent is Mexico a democracy, and when did it really become a democracy? And is there still some work to do with regard to democratization? Because, it's pretty safe to say that in the days of the PRI, it was a more overt, like managed democracy, in the sense that I would say all democracies in practice are to some extent managed democracies, but the PRI was like a overt managed democracy in the sense that it didn't have party competition. It was like more like a dictatorship. But since, was it like 2003? I mean, it seems there has been a lot of party competition to some extent in Mexico, but then again, you also read about journalists getting assassinated here and there, and of course the ongoing corruption in the various governments that have taken power. So I'm curious to what extent Mexico is a democracy and when this change has evolved and where it's going.
On paper, Mexico has always been a democracy, at least since 1917, because we have actual guarantees that allow for third-party systems, which is something that's fundamentally different from countries like the United States, or I guess Canada. I don't know if Canada also has legislation specifically put in place to, does it?
We have multiple parties, but we have an electoral system of single-member districts. I'm not exactly sure the difference between the Mexican system, which is actually more like the US, it seems. It's a presidential system. But in Canada, it's a parliamentary system, but there's single-member districts, which make it very hard for third parties to win, even though third parties exist and they do have seats in parliament. It's very hard for a third party to displace the dominant liberal conservative parties, because whoever wins the election in that district, for example, wins all of the seats, even if he wins by just one vote. So
yeah, in Mexico, we have a proportional representation.
Yeah, it's a mixed member parliament.
I see.
Yeah.
So in that regard, it's actually more democratic than Canada.
On paper, yes.
On paper, yeah. Like third parties are basically like constitutionally guaranteed seats, the way it's set up. For example, for like the Senate, they have a system where there's a party list, and the party that gets the first place in the Senate ticket gets 2 seats, but the runner up gets 1 seat no matter what. So it kind of like prevents like winner takes all scenarios, at least on paper, because this last election, the Morena coalition got so many votes that it overpowered all that.
Is the president elected separately from the Congress?
Yeah, it's a direct election for the president.
Okay, so yeah, in that regard, it's like the US if it had proportional representation.
Basically, it's like 300 seats are elected directly, and I'd say this district system is very similar to the United States. And then there's 200 seats, which are elected in a party list proportional system, which I guess is kind of closer to like some parliamentary. And this guarantees that there's at least like 200 seats in the Congress that on paper reflect the overall trends and demographics of the country, while still having that, winner takes all electoral system for the majority of seats.
Hmm. So under the PRI, there were other parties, but they pretty much had to play ball, sort of like how the opposition parties in contemporary Russia do, or else they kind of the candidates disappear or just they just rig an election. So like what like took the shift exactly to institutionalize party competition? Because it's one thing to have it on paper, it's another thing to have it in practice. How has Mexico's democracy evolved in the last give or take 20 years?
Yeah. So actually, I want to take us back further because you asked earlier, we were talking about how long it took AMLO to take power, right?
Mm.
And in some ways, you could see AMLO's victory as a delivery of the promise of democracy, in the sense that back in 1917, when we established the United States of Mexico, we thought that we could, by putting it on paper, create a democratic system of government. And I would say that it took since then, like literally 100 years, 101 years, right, to actually bring democracy into practice. Because, like Connor said, back when Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas lost because of fraud, the parties came together and they agreed to a transition into democracy, which would pretty much become they were trying to create the United States ping pong, right? Of, baton.
The
Yeah.
the two-party cartel, right?
Yes, exactly. They were trying to establish a two-party cartel between PAN and PRI, which it's so funny because for over a decade they denied it, and then they stopped denying it when they started their alliance, right? For to try to win the presidency and lost. But anyway, so back to the question. Yeah, Lo, what he did was that he stayed the course. But you're talking, he took up the flag of a fight that's been going on for generations, and this victory has been paid in blood, and it's not even a real victory, right? But it's been paid in blood by the students of 68, I'm sorry, and all of the victims of the dirty war. Because we back in 68, that was pretty much the demand, right? I mean, there were also demands for Maoism and so on and so forth, but the primary demand was a transparent state, no repression, right? No kidnappings, because the state would just straight up kidnap you and kill you, and you had no recourse. And that was mild. When the government started just kidnapping you and only kidnapping you and just killing you, that was progress. Because before that, the government will first kill your family, then they would make you flee, and then they would kill you wherever you fled. The government was just back during the Maximato and the quasi-fascist pre-dictatorship. Things were foul, and that was so Cardenas broke from that. All right, but he couldn't break from that at the same time. And when he had to give power back to the party, because okay, so Cardenas was a pretty president, right? But he had a lot of popular support, too much popular support, and that excess of popular support allowed him to implement policies that went against party line, right? But his successor couldn't do that. And that's what created the regress into neoliberalism, or I guess the evolution into neoliberalism of the PRI eventually, right? 3 decades later. And that whole thing, that's what eventually pretty much compromised all the parties in Mexico. Because
The step into neoliberalism meant that pretty much every warlord of the parties had some ties with international capital, and you had to deal with international capital to try to do politics in Mexico, which was functionally impossible until AMLO. And AMLO, he quote unquote took the fight to international capital, the segments of international capital, to be clear. But that's the thing, right? AMLO is much like Deng, a straight-on pragmatist, and he says it. He says that pragmatism is a virtue in politics, and he also says that politics, to echo something you said earlier, is choosing between two of the least undesirables. He uses another term, but I don't remember the exact translation. And he's just he knows that politics is all about compromise, and that's what has garnered him support from all across the political aisle, politics, because people understand that he will make pragmatic decisions, and that gives people confidence. Even things like the judicial reform don't really shake confidence in the economy. I mean, you had like tiny adjustments to the US dollar and peso ratio, but people know that AMLO is, at some points, you can even describe him as neoliberal in that respect. He advocates for a moral administration of capitalism and nothing else. And that honestly gives people confidence.
One of the things that, just to add that, because I was reading, I have his book right here, so I was just quickly studying to get ready for this. So I was waiting to use this quote. But one of the things that I found very interesting is that he talks about the post-neoliberalism, and he thinks of his government as such. He states that his, and I quote, the post-neoliberal Mexican model, sustained in the concept of moral economy, is also another response to of those who, to justify neoliberalism, esgrimir, what was it, like
to sword fight, to sword fight, what?
Yeah,
no, to duel, to
okay, yeah, to duel, that there was no other way possible. So I think that he sees himself as a post neoliberal leftist. But the thing is, and I think that the question really stands still, is that did we actually move away from neoliberalism? And I believe that we did not. We have not. However, what I think that he has pushed forward is a very distinct narrative, and he mentions it in his foundational, the reason for foundation of Morena is that he sees this sort of moral decay of, one of the precepts of Morena is that he says that we need to take into account that the actual crisis is not just because of lack of material goods, which in here he appeals to, you can interpret this as like the class warfare, but also because of the loss of spiritual and moral values and cultural values. So it's indispensable to push a new way of thought, to build a moral idea that holds precepts that push for love to family, to nature, and to the nation. So, and I'm not going to read the rest of it, but you can see that he has this, it's not just class warfare, and it's not just, the differences between the material goods and the power to buy things, but it's also things that relate to the morality people. And you could say that this has also an origin of like the religious Mexican background, which, goes back to the independence, which is celebrated yesterday and today, which is basically the role that religion played, specifically Catholic Christian religion, Judeo-Christian religion, into the political movement of the independence of Mexico. And I think it's a very interesting mix of things, because I don't think that in any other place in the world you would see the left so linked. I mean, the current political left, whose leader is linked to, or whose leader exalts this idea of morality in a spiritual sense, linked to Judeo-Christian values, and try to push forward that into his political agenda, and using that to his own political discourse, which sometimes he repeats ad nauseum in his morning conferences.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting way to set, the ideological foundation of Morena. But I think that like knowing Morena's ideology helps to really explain how their social policies work, because Morena is a very redistributive government. I would say that if neoliberalism in Mexico was a government that focused, so much on macroeconomic stability indicators, detriment to the bottom, Morena is the opposite. They turned it on its head, where the subject of the economy is wealth redistribution and making sure that people at the bottom get their fair share. We talked about the minimum wage, for example, where they raised the minimum wage to effectively redistribute wealth in the country to lower income brackets. If you look at like a lot of other social programs, they also just effectively function as wealth distribution. They cut funding for a program from the previous government that Morena sometimes correctly diagnosed as being inefficient, corrupt, and instead just gives people cash. Whether it's through an extended pension for pensioners, or I think now Claudia is going to do like grants for all students in Mexico, where they're just going to give families cash if their kids in school.
And did raising the minimum wage cause the wage price spiral, as the economists call it, where you get hyperinflation when you give money to the poors?
Yeah, that's like so funny, because for like decades, the minimum wage was kind of like viewed, like you say, it was like this orthodox economic view that, oh, if you raise the minimum wage, everything's getting more expensive. So I think for like 10 years or more, it was effectively frozen with like inflation. And I even remember, during the build up to the AMLO election, people were worried, like, oh my God, he's going to raise the wage. Awful things are going to happen. And instead, poverty went down. I mean, I don't have like the exact numbers at hand, but there's like economic research that points to, poverty reduction in the south and the center of the country to be attributed to a reduction in income poverty. And I'm not sure if there's like a proper like cause and effect analysis. I the exact term on the top of my head in English, but proper analysis to, see if this is attributed to these social programs. But I mean, wow, they elected the government that took a lot of policies to put money in people's hands, and income poverty went down so much that it adjusted overall poverty rates. I mean, it kind of seems like some ideas in economic question. And that is such a powerful thing about the Morena administration, is that, they had the political will to challenge orthodoxy. And it kind of links into how AMLO emphasizes family, and like, I'm not sure, like conservative per se values, but it's kind of more parochial view of the home. And it's that instead of like targeted social programs focusing on social issues, the Morena ideology, for better or for worse, is let's give more money to families, and then the family, which they consider to be a unit of society, can best decide how to handle it. It's almost like kind of like Friedmanite view to things. And I kind of have to agree with it. I mean, I studied economics. I do believe that more often than not, just giving money to people without bureaucrats will be more efficient than trying to come up with a formula that will magically determine how to define who needs money and who doesn't. But it does kind of lead to some tone-deaf ideas about social issues because, for example, the family can be a space for, solidarity and instillment of values. But I saw this, stat the other day, the vast majority of sexual abuse, for example, and this is not just Mexico, but I believe in the world, comes from immediate family members. So when you have this like hyper focus on the family unit, you do kind of think like fall into some like mistakes of reinforcing, social issues in Mexico that do really need to be challenged.
But even still, what I find interesting about Mexico is that despite its government, its progressive government, not really being so rhetorically hardline on the social issues, like in practice, they have seemingly passed some progressive legislation. Like I believe Claudia, when she was, say, like this effectively mayor of Mexico City, she legalized gay marriage well before the United States did, the federal level. And I'm not exactly sure the gay marriage laws in Mexico now, federally speaking, but I have heard that like access to contraception is widely available, and you have like major progressions on gender equality in Mexico, and this is all done, without this kind of like id pol rhetoric that you see from like the unsuccessful left-wing parties in the global north.
Just also like I think that it's pretty interesting that even some reactionaries have tried to certain reactionaries from the opposition, the right-wing opposition here in Mexico, try to forcibly push this anti-woke agenda as if it were a replica of whatever Republican rhetoric has been for the past, like, since the Trump era stuff. And that hasn't worked at all. Like, it's pretty surprising that even though Mexican society, you can consider it pretty conservative socially, these issues are not permeating the Mexican society at all. Like, there is some resistance to these things, but you can identify who is resisting to progressive policies, socially progressive policies, and you can pinpoint like the organization, like for example, I'm translating here, the National Front for the Family, which is basically just a right-wing reactionary group of like pro-family tradcath values, and they were constantly against gay marriage, let alone whatever trans issues they might be discussing, and they have been consistently like middle to middle high class white people in those like places where they try to protest. So you can identify it's also a certain class issue, and lower class, I think that, or at least that's my perception, they don't really care as much because all they want to do, and that's quite literally like all they need to do is just to try to live through the day. And so I think that AMLO has been spot on in addressing the progressive issues, socially progressive issues, not by mentioning them directly, and also to, yes, address those issues, but his main focus has always been, economically focused, as like, minimum wage raise, etc.
It's interesting, yeah, because AMLO doesn't talk about these issues. It's not like the mainstream, like rhetorical agenda of Morena. But, curiously, if you put a Morena state congress to vote abortion or trans rights or something like that, more often than not, they'll vote very progressively, honestly, like to the left of their electorate, and it's just not talked about much. And I don't want to understate the role that social movements have in this. I think it's more of a dynamic where activists are, lobbying with Morena. But the fact that Morena is receptive to that is great, underappreciated.
You mentioned that like the average Mexican is rather indifferent to a lot of these social issues, and I actually think that this is kind of dispositionally the attitude of most people in general on social issues. I think a lot of people have this sort of libertarian disposition on social issues that like, okay, people can do what they want, but like don't shove it down my throat. I think that's like how the average Joe thinks. You really strengthen the right if you position culture issues too front and center, because the right, I think in most countries, tends to pretty much live off of social issues, because the right does not usually have popular economic agendas. It just doesn't. So they have to rely on something to have their fuel, right? And that is social issues. So it's very easy for the right to like mobilize people on these culture war issues by saying like, oh, they're trying to steal your kids and make your kids trans or whatever. It makes sense why that doesn't really work so well in Mexico, that like culture war strategy, because if the opposition isn't that extreme about it, like, yes, they're passing progressive legislation, but like the bulk of their politics isn't just paying lip service to like social issues, it's actually meeting material conditions. The average electorate isn't that stupid. So like they're going to see through that right wing like talking point, you know? But I want to bring it back to like the policies of Morena and its relation to the pink tide, because a lot of what you've described are the policies of the Morena government seem to be kind of similar in this broader trend of like pink tide politics. Some have called this the second pink tide. And you mentioned a lot of people who are part of the Morena party were former far leftists, some even guerrilla fighters. And this does remind me of like the origins of Lula's government. Lula's party, of course, Dilma Rousseff was a Marxist guerrilla fighter against a dictatorship. And so is Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia. And I find it interesting because you do have this classic story of like far leftist turned moderate reformer. But except in these examples, they at least have a party to put forth an independent center-left vision, whereas in America you have, and in Canada, you have a lot of former leftists, but because there isn't like a party to, especially not in America, they just end up becoming part of the Democrats. They just get sucked into the Democrats. But I guess the question I want to put forth to you guys is sort of how Morena relates to the pink tide and its relationship to the other pink tide governments around the world, like Venezuela, like Bolivia, Evo Morales, Brazil, etc.
Yeah, Morena like has positioned itself as like a member of this trend, the pink tide. Like I was just thinking, just very recently, Morena announced a formal alliance. SOE, the Spanish Socialist Workers Party, which is kind of surprising because it's actually the more centrist, moderate left. I'd say they're to the right of Morena. And they just announced, at least a rhetorical alliance on progressive grounds. They've had similar alliances with the Brazilian Labor Party. And I think even like DSA, America, the National Committee, does have working relations with Morena. So, yeah, when there was a coup against Evo Morales and the crisis in Peru, in both cases, the Mexican government intervened to pull these left-wing politicians out of their countries and get them to Mexico or another safe country, which is, when you think about it, a pretty extraordinary political policy act, to not just like lend rhetorical support to government, but actually like intervene. That's more support, that's action. So yeah, I would say that Morena is like a very internationalist party. And that's, I think, another lesson is that you do need to conceive of yourself as part of an international trend. Because the right does this. I mean, look at like Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro saw what was happening in the United States with Trump, and he very effectively, connected with Steve Bannon and the Trump family, and basically hard launched Trumpism in Latin America. And like, yeah, like what a terrible thing that happened. Strategically, he understood the importance of like conceiving yourself as an international. In both cases, the Mexican government intervened to pull these left-wing politicians out of their countries and get them to Mexico or another safe country, which is, when you think about it, a pretty extraordinary political policy act, to not just like lend rhetorical support to government, but actually like intervene. That's more support, that's action. So yeah, I would say that Morena is like a very internationalist party. And that's, I think, another lesson is that you do need to conceive of yourself as part of an international trend. Because the right does this. I mean, look at like Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro saw what was happening in the United States with Trump, and he very effectively, connected with Steve Bannon and the Trump family, and basically hard launched Trumpism in Latin America. And like, yeah, like what a terrible thing that happened. Strategically, he understood the importance of like conceiving yourself as an international.
Yeah, it does seem, with the exception of Argentina and Javier Milei, Latin America seems to be going in a more left direction. Would you say so?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's complicated, but I mean, it's kind of like a pendulum because, like, yeah, you do have like Argentina going hard right, and you have like I think like countries like Chile, which the next presidential election probably will also go back to the right. But yeah, Brazil, Colombia, there's a lot of countries that are, yeah, like I think like voting for left wing governments en masse. Like it does seem like at least liberalism is losing a lot of steam.
And I think that a lot of that is because of the history of Latin America itself and the fights with colonialism and neocolonialism. Basically, that has enabled people to just not buy into this international company free market rhetoric. So there's definitely way more resistance here, especially for example, the Zapatista movement, which also has pretty harsh critics on this government as well, even though, both might consider themselves leftists in a way. They're not friends at all. That's why Ernesto had reservations by affirming that there were Zapatistas in full construction of Morena, which, I don't doubt myself as well, but, it's not too much.
Yeah, this is. I do want to mention the Zapatistas for a second, because prior to going to Mexico, and whenever I travel to any country, I like to freshen some of my understanding on the general political history of that country, and that's sort of how I've been getting myself into learning about Mexican politics. But prior to that, what I had heard about Mexican politics, and more specifically the Mexican left, was really just the Zapatistas, because what I had heard was mostly from white leftist anarchists talking about the Zapatistas and how cool they are. And yeah, they are pretty cool. But from what it seems, based on what I've learned so far, the Zapatistas aren't that significant of a force in Mexico, at least not outside Chiapas, the region in which they hold power. And in terms of who has really brought the most transformative changes that Mexicans actually experience, that most average Mexicans experience, it's really been the reformist Morena government.
Yeah.
I was baffled that I hadn't heard of any of this stuff. And I guess it's because it's fashionable on the Western left to just, talk about revolution, but it's not that cool to talk about the nitty gritties of politics and economics.
I don't want to I guess understate Zapatismo, because in the 90s, that was when they were a significant force. When they had their initial uprising, I think it was 94. This was in the middle of NAFTA negotiations. And I think this was one of the predecessor events to, AMLO being able to win the election. Because the Zapatistas, in the middle of, negotiation free trade agreement, took up arms and forced the whole world, not just because they were a global phenomenon, to look at Mexico and ask, what matters more, free trade agreements and macroeconomic indicators, or the quality of life of the most vulnerable in society, like indigenous farmers in Chiapas. So I would say that today, Zapatistas are a very regional phenomenon. They are connected with, groups all across Mexico. For example, I've actually met Zapatistas at events organized by the local Communist Party. They have a working relationship. But nowadays, yeah, it's more their actual praxis is very regional to Chiapas.
When they had that uprising against the free trade agreements, I do recall that they were Maoist at the beginning, and then they kind of transformed into more libertarian.
Marxist-Leninist. Yes.
Because they're not really anarchist or traditional Marxist-Leninists at all, from what I've seen. They're kind of their own unique ideology.
Yeah, indeed. They call themselves Zapatistas because of that. So they are, you made allusion to the National Liberation Army, which was another thing, and it was its predecessor. And then the Zapatistas, they rose up, and they were first a Marxist-Leninist organization. And the complexities of real life made them restructure the organization, restructure form of government. And to bring it back to the Constitution, the second article actually details that indigenous people have a right to their own form of government. So they are pretty much exercising their constitutional right, to be clear. And they don't influence Mexican politics, but they do, because they set a precedent, right? It's like an amparo here right now. No longer, hopefully. But so in Mexico, if you get a judge, kind of like Roe v. Wade, like in the United States, I guess it's the same thing, where it's an appeal. Okay, so you can get a judge to file an appeal, and they must circumvent laws and so on, and that's its precedent. Anyway, the Zapatistas are setting a precedent for a response towards the government from self-organized people, and they aren't trying to push the project beyond its borders, but rather they believe that it's a project that is meant for Chiapas, right? And that it is on the rest of society to answer to that project and help them move past it, because they can't change the world by themselves, of course.
Andres, did you want to say anything? I believe I think you had a comment.
No, I think that they're not as relevant as they were. I know that when I visited on my honeymoon, they were present in certain regions, and we were like just warned not to get too close to certain areas, because they also get, like, they're obviously armed, and it's not that they are dangerous, it's just that certain territories in Chiapas are constantly being disputed between certain feuds or certain like groups, and yeah, so yeah, they definitely exercise their own agenda of like their own rights to self-determination and to their own political ways. I see them as sort of like an anarcho-communist group because of their, I believe at some point, and I think it's still the case, that they just barter things instead of like using just local currency or whatever. So they have their own economic also like policies in their own territories. But yeah, like they do recently they sent out a public statement about the I think it was a harsh critic to AMLO in general and to his government, which it's understandable that they lashed out a lot against AMLO's military policy, because the fact that AMLO has given the military a lot of power is not something that you could question. That's a fact. But I'm not sure like the current state of their leadership right now. I don't think they're as relevant as they were before, specifically on the 94 uprising.
I say the Zapatistas, yeah, their ambitions are not like, it's kind of like Ernesto. So like their ambitions aren't to like set an ideology for the world to follow. It's to, uplift Chiapas and then guide the world on like, figuring things out for every community or every nation. Like, for example, I know that Rojava, part of Kurdistan in northern Syria, that was heavily in the Zapatistas, but they understood like, you can't just follow a Zapatista recipe. You need to adapt it to the local context and circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I'm always curious as to different ways to arrange democracy, and the democratic ideas that come out of the Zapatistas, which were implemented in Rojava, are of interest to me because I'm always looking at different models. But I was quite shocked that when I talked to one Mexican local who actually didn't even know who the Zapatistas were, this person was my age. And I was thinking, like, if they were a very big force, I figure like everyone would at least be aware of who they are, right? So I was a little shocked by that. And then that's when I asked you guys about their significance and stuff. But yeah, like, it's not to understate what they have achieved, right? Because it is, fighting against globalization and doing for a community is impressive indeed. But I think the point of emphasis here is that a lot of Western leftists looking from the outside sometimes want to look for like cool examples of revolution as opposed to like the more boring gradual achievements. They want to look at like these big events of uprising and militarism and stuff like that. But you mentioned the militarization of Mexico and the buildup of the military. That's another thing the AMLO government has been criticized for. And that brings me to one of the last questions I want to ask on the public segment, which is that of corruption. Because when people think Mexico, from the outside, they often think corruption. And there's this, known conflict between the cartels and the government and the corruption with cartels in the government. And this, of course, has evolved a lot in the history of Mexico. So I'm curious as to the state of corruption and the cartels with the Morena government and the difference between the state of Mexico now with regard to that and the war on drugs, because of course that was a major period in this conflict. And yeah, so that's a pretty big question I want to leave you guys with.
I mean, I guess like from my experiences, like, knowing people who work in politics and kind of seeing like not behind the scenes per se, but kind of getting a feel for how things work. One of the biggest like failures of Morena and the forced transformation is that it did not, find a way to attend this issue. Like, because even though, there's a new left-wing government, a government that is, actively positioning itself as leftist and taking drastic changes in how the country is ran, the political economy of Mexico, the way I see it, still revolves around drug cartels and corruption big time. And for me, it's kind of like one of those like things that do make me feel bleak. Like, I do ask like, what is the way out of, to get elected to office in Mexico or gaining political power, play ball with corruption and, drug cartels, which, do have a lot of hard power to determine things, especially at the local level, where if you, get elected to office and you're not in good terms with the local cartel, good luck. But yeah, it's just, it's tough to really address. I kind of say that in terms of corruption and drug trafficking, if it hasn't changed at all.
There was an attempt to radically change that, right? Didn't go so well.
Yeah, the drug war. Yeah, let's just have the military going and see what happens. Yeah, 2006, Calderon, for whatever reason, I mean, there's multiple theories. After being elected president, he ordered the military to take a far more active role in, combating organized crime. And this was basically, I guess the way I see it, was kind of like throwing gasoline on a fire. Because it was true that in the years leading up to that, something had to be done about drug cartels. This is a context where new cartels like Los Zetas were forming, which were introducing military tactics to organized crime, really like upping the ante on these terrorism and violence by these organizations. But Calderon just kind of took a very blunt approach of sending the military out in the streets and horribly escalated things. I think anyone in the world knows that, after 2006, Mexico got a lot more dangerous. And I mean, all three of us, Ernesto, Andrés, and I, we lived in Mexico during, that period, and everyone has stories and experiences about how that changed their lives.
Which we won't go into right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I guess like for me, it was just kind of like my family wasn't like never experienced anything heavy, but fact of life that like, the classic saying is you did not have your parent contacts on your phone as mom or dad. You'd have them as your names because your phone got stolen. Then people would, look for the contacts, see who are your parents and try to extort them and saying they had you kidnapped. There was also just things like with curfews and a lot of little small details in life that were kind of conditioned by the fact that during that period of violent fact of life, it was just a fact of life that in your day to day something could happen. And when I moved back to the United States, after like 2019, it was almost like a transitionary period where I kind of realized like, holy shit, that was normal. And that's something that I think really conditioned Mexican politics and life is, yeah, organized crime does in a way run the country.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
heard that people had to do lockdowns all the time because
Yeah.
there was always like violence between the gangs and the governments.
It's worth noting that this was a bullshit strategy, because what he did was because okay, so I guess something that our audience might not think about and might be even out me as some sort of conservative figure, but the army is actually good, guys. Like, in a sense that it is, I would appreciate it if it withered away, but as it stands right now, you can't have countries without armies. For a variety of reasons, which we won't go into also, because of how late we are into the podcast. But what AMLO has been doing with his militarization was that he's been hiring people through the army and putting them to work in like manual labor tasks, which is the lot of the majority of the country. Like right now, the majority of jobs are manufacturing jobs. And when the choice is to work at a sweatshop or to work as a drug dealer, people prefer to work as a drug dealer. And what Felipe Calderon did with his war on drugs is that he took the army as as the corporation that it is, and it took the workers of the army, all the soldiers, and he just pointed their guns at their cousins, at their uncles, at their brothers, and made them kill them. That's what they did. Because a lot of people, just like in many countries, go into the army as a last resort, right? The army is pretty much the employer of last resort for a lot of people. You can't get a job here, there, whatever. You get a job in the army, right? And then not only that, you get benefits. You get plenty of benefits. And it's very grim in some countries. The United States, I would never go into the army in the United States. But in Mexico, actually, military service is compulsory. And just as a last tangent, because I was thinking about the state of veterans, right? I was sitting in the metro in France, and I saw an ad for veteran welfare, right? And that makes sense in the United States, right? I'm in the United States. I see an ad for veteran welfare. I'm thinking, of course, the United States is always at war. But I wasn't thinking, when I was in France, it dawned on me that French veterans are American veterans, because what the only thing that the French do with their army is fight America's wars. Yeah, you know what I mean? And so anyway, to make my point, it's that Felipe Calderon did a terrible thing. He took the state apparatus and he turned it against the people, like straight up. And while AMLO has been doing the same thing in terms of wrenching control of the military, I mean, I just have to point at any Latin American coup to show what the dangers are in not embracing the military, right? As president, just Chile, since we just had it's an anniversary, right? All it took is some crazy general to think, you know what? I have more authority than the president. I'm gonna capitulate to the foreign capital, and finger snap, and it happens. AMLO knows that that can't happen, especially as the neighbor of the United States. So he's commandeered the army. Yeah, go ahead, Connor. I'm done.
Yeah, just a really quick thing is that AMLO has upfront said in his interviews that when he was a student and the Chilean coup happened, that was a formative event in politics. I would say that's not even a theory; it's just a fact that AMLO is embracing the military because he knows that there's a guy that's guns, and if you're a left-wing politician who fights against a lot of powerful people, and you don't have the military on your side, then very short life. And I think the issue with the military in Mexico, from like you said, Ernesto, is that there's a very distorted role of the military in public life. There was this interview I read, a journalist who was a general during the Zapatista uprising regarding the military's role in putting down the guerrilla fighters. And he asks the general, so has the military ever thought about the material conditions that create civil unrest or crime or these issues? Or do you just respond as they happen? And the general like kind of correctly said, well, I'm a soldier. My job isn't to solve social issues, to shoot enemies of the state. And it was like such a crude thing, but it's true. And I think like one of Calderon's like colossal mistakes was putting the military in a role that had to be taken by law, because civilian law enforcement in Mexico has always been in dire condition. You know, they're underfunded, understaffed, underarmed, you know, extremely corrupt and compromised by organized crime. And really, you know, organized crime isn't a military issue, it's a social one. You know, it gets solved by, you know, and AMLO has taken some work on this, eliminating the desperation that, you know, pushes otherwise, you know, honest people in this line of work. It's, you know, effectively reforming courts so criminals are held accountable and, you know, things like money laundering, financing are possible. And it's, you know, equipping police forces to carry out these tasks. 'Cause like you said, Ernesto, yeah, you know, philosophically, we can talk about whether we want police and soldiers in society, but today, for a nation to function, you need laws, you need force, you know, and police officers to carry them out. And the military in Mexico is just put in this very inappropriate position of carrying out something that's not really its job. And I think that's like kind of like the long-term risk of AMLO. 'Cause I totally understand why he's embracing the military. It's a matter of pragmatism. But, you know, the military industrial complex in Mexico is a big root of a lot of the structural issues in the country. So I am concerned in the long run, how will the left, you know, form that when it's now institutionally committed with the military?
Yeah, if you can't beat them, sometimes you have to join them.
Yeah.
And that is a classic Latin American problem that you see if like the government doesn't align itself, or at least, you know, has tensions with the military, you know, they just get cooed. That I mean, there's risks to that, of course, with the Venezuelan case, because of course Venezuela, you know, avoided a coup by essentially the government more or less kind of bribing the military, like using a lot of oil funds to enrich a lot of generals. And but as a result, Venezuela has become kind of much less democratic, especially in recent years, partially due to this corruption, you could say. So yeah, there is like it's a kind of contradiction, a dialectical contradiction that needs to be worked through, undoubtedly. But with I do want to, I am curious though, like if the military, if if this could be solved in Mexico by doing what the U.S. does, because the U.S. has an interesting approach to military, which is like a separation of powers within the military. Like in the US, why the military has never had a big political role. I mean, you guys, the military industrial complex has a big political role. The Pentagon has a role, but like the military itself is heavily divided into different branches, like the US Navy, the National Guard, and the Air Force, and the other factions are actually led by separate hierarchies that are like very independent of each other. And the idea of this arrangement was that if one tried to coup the United States, the other one would naturally seize power in response, because like it would be against the other's interest for like that higher like general to like seize at the expense of the rest. So it's like an interesting sort of like game theory. They figure that like everyone is power interested, but if you just split the authority of the generals and the different military hierarchies, you would avoid this problem. But I'm not sure to what extent, like, if that's like possible in the in various Latin American countries, but I know little about that, so I can't really comment.
We have a division of power on paper. On paper, every branch of the military, we have a National Guard, we have a Navy, an Army, we have like even police are also segmented and so on. But on practical terms, it's just a bunch of families that control everything.
Yeah, and another thing too is that the military was institutionally designed by the pre-dictatorship to be very subservient to the federal government. Like the kind of like it was designed so like the kind of people who'd become generals would be like, for lack of a better word, like lapdogs, like not the kind of like profiles that would rebel against the government or who would have political ambition outside the military. So that's kind of like an important factor too in understanding like Mexican drug war, is that the military, kind of like I said earlier in this interview, sees itself as just having, a mission to follow orders from the federal government, usually to wage war and shoot motherfuckers. And that, I think, in itself has also kind of like stopped Mexico from having civil wars after the revolution, or, the other sort of like coups or disturbances that other countries have, as part of the perfect dictatorship. And then we had to transition to democracy, and now we have this really incestuous dynamic where, the military has just doesn't have a clear role in the Mexican state, because it's, it has, it's officially, the branch of the government that handles national defense, but it also does public works for the AMLO administration. It's also law enforcement, National Guard. And a lot of that, I think, is kind of inherited from the fact that during the free government, it was designed to just do whatever the federal government wants.
I honestly am not sure if that is sustainable in the long term. I mean, centralizing the various divisions of the military in general, like as the armed forces, different armed forces that we have, into one head is definitely questionable. Some people were saying that it's better if we have civil command of the armed forces, but a specific division of the armed forces, which was basically tasked with, law enforcement, the National Guard, which replaced the federal police, which was like the most corrupt institution of security institution of like all time, which thrived under Calderon's rule. And so, sort of like in between political vengeance and also like necessary just to, just throw away federal police and instead have a division that is commanded, or it's like a direct arm of the military to work on national security. But it's still like, adding a civilian to command a military force, I would also agree that is just, I wouldn't say it's effective, because what kind of capacity would a civilian have versus a military general in terms of like commanding, the armed forces, whether that is military or civil guard. So question still stands.
Yeah, it's hard to see where that will go. And one thing I remember you mentioning was that the resounding victory for the Morena government is fantastic news in the sense that they can, pass constitutional level reforms and not be blocked as easily, and do these reforms for the people, which are popular. And if you actually believe in democracy, you do believe that, like, the representatives should represent their electorate. But one caveat to this that you mentioned is that, maybe if Morena is so powerful, they might actually eventually not have an incentive to keep pushing left policies if they feel confident that they can keep on winning power without really doing what needs to be done. But whether that is the case, remains to be seen. But without further ado, we've been talking for like 2 hours plus on the public segment. If you guys have some time, I would love to talk a little bit in the back room about, Mexico, but also about what you think about the other leaders of Latin America at the moment, the other leaders of the Pink Tide, because you told me all sort of very interesting things that I hadn't thought about before, about like, the differences between Gustavo Petro and Gabriel Boric in Chile, and, who's good at politics and who kind of isn't. Also very curious about the relationship between Mexico and Venezuela, because Venezuela's recent election has sort of disturbed a lot of relations between Latin American Pink Tide governments. But yeah, if you guys enjoyed this segment, feel free to become a patron. And those who have become a patron know that you get access to all sort of exclusive episodes. We have like 36 segments at this point that are completely exclusive on Patreon. It's where all the cool shit happens. It's where all the cool people go. If you're not a patron already, what are you doing? Come join us. It's, cheaper than a cup of coffee at Starbucks. So see you there. And thank you guys for being here.
Thank you for inviting us.
Pleasure.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimists, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.